The cold was unforgiving. The snow fell like silence from the sky, thick, relentless, and heavy. In the middle of a forgotten road near Seoul, in the winter of 1951, a British soldier stood alone. His name was Thomas Blake, a seasoned veteran, worn by 2 wars and too many memories. His boots were falling apart. His coat, thin and torn, barely kept the wind at bay. But even in that frozen silence, there was something moved. A figure, a woman, shivering, lost among the remains of a village reduced to ashes. She wasn't a soldier, no weapon, no uniform. Just eyes, tired, frightened, and full of stories the world had stopped listening to. Thomas didn't ask who she was. He didn't hesitate. He simply gave her his coat, the only protection he had left. That simple act of kindness in the heart of war would echo far beyond that moment. Because the woman he saved was someone who would change his life forever. This is not just a story about war, it's about what survives in war. Humanity, compassion, and the courage to care when everything else is falling apart. Welcome to the channel. If you believe these stories should never be forgotten, join us. Subscribe now and turn on notifications to keep every memory, every voice, and every sacrifice alive. Without further delay, let's get straight to the point. Thomas Blake carried burdens that couldn't be seen, but were always there, just beneath the surface. He had once stormed the beaches of Normandy, trudged through the mud and chaos of Monte Cassino, and watched too many friends disappear into the fog of battle. But it wasn't just the war that left marks on him, it was what came after. When the world celebrated peace, Thomas came home to silence. His wife, Emily, gentle and strong, fell ill during one of the coldest winters. With no steady income and the country still rebuilding, she couldn't get the care she needed. Pneumonia took her quietly, in the same small apartment they had once called home. Not long after, the weight of grief and poverty left Thomas unable to care for their only child. Social services stepped in. They said it was for the best. But to Thomas, it felt like losing his family all over again. From that moment on, he stopped searching for a home. He became a man constantly in motion, never rooted, never resting, base to base, mission to mission. He volunteered for every dangerous assignment, not out of pride or duty, but because standing still hurt more than the front lines ever could. The barracks offered no comfort. Each night in those cold shelters was just another reminder of what had been taken. He wasn't just sleeping on a cot. He was lying in memories of Emily's laughter, of a child's footsteps echoing through a hallway, of quiet mornings that would never come back. Other soldiers called him dependable, solid, but Thomas knew the truth. He wasn't strong, he was surviving, and every new mission was another way to outrun the silence that waited when the gunfire stopped. Still, beneath the weariness and the worn-out uniform, there was something unbreakable. A quiet kind of courage that didn't need recognition. A heart that still remembered how to care, even after everything had been stripped away. And it was that part of him, the part that refused to disappear, that would lead him to cross paths with someone else lost in the ruins of war. Someone who, just like him, was searching for a reason to keep going. That moment hadn't come yet, but it was getting closer. And when it did, it would remind them both that even in the darkest winters, kindness can still be the fire that keeps us alive. That night, long after the wind had quieted and the snow had settled over the broken village, Sumin Park sat alone in the corner of a dimly lit medical tent. The heater sputtered. The air still held the sharp bite of winter. But what kept her awake wasn't the cold. It was the memory of a coat. She had accepted it from a stranger hours earlier, a British sergeant, silent and worn, who had wrapped it around her shoulders without a word. Just a single look, tired but kind. And then he disappeared into the storm. Sumin had seen many acts of survival in that war, but this had been something else. As she folded the coat beside her, her fingers brushed against the inner pocket. Something was tucked inside. Curious, she reached in and pulled out a small folded scrap of paper. The edges were soft from age. Inside was a note, half in English, half in Korean, scribbled in a child's handwriting. Alongside it, a simple drawing. A little boy smiling next to a man in uniform. Above them, 5 words. crooked, uneven, but full of heart. My father, my hero. For a moment, everything around her faded. The groans of the wounded, the hurried footsteps of nurses, the dull hum of generators. All she could hear was the beating of her own heart. She had treated hundreds of soldiers, patched wounds, steadied hands, whispered comfort into ears trembling with fear. But none of them had ever given her something so human, so unguarded. That coat was more than fabric. It carried warmth that went beyond the body. It was a reminder that even here, surrounded by pain, there were still pieces of people who remembered how to care, who still loved, who still hoped. Sumin held the paper close, feeling the weight of it, not heavy, but profound. She didn't know who the boy was. She didn't know where that father was now, but she knew this: the man who gave her that coat hadn't lost everything. Not really, because somewhere, in the middle of all that war, a child had seen him as a hero, and now so did she. Something had shifted inside her. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a deep, unexplainable pull. Sumin Park couldn't forget the man who had given her his coat, nor the quiet message tucked within it. It wasn't enough to simply remember him. She needed to find him. In the following days, between tending to the wounded and organizing supplies, she reached out to American officers in the medical division. Her request was unusual, but her determination was impossible to ignore. With their help, she began searching through troop movement records and even reached across the ocean to contact British veteran archives. It was like following footprints in the snow. Most had already faded. Thomas Blake wasn't an easy man to track. He never stayed in one place long. He moved with the storms, always stationed near the front, where the cold bit harder and the danger never slept. His name appeared in the margins of reports, in the notes of officers who described him as reliable but withdrawn, always volunteers for the worst assignments, and prefers no recognition. In a world that rewarded those who stood out, Thomas seemed to vanish on purpose. Then finally, a small break. A Canadian soldier stationed near a volatile stretch of the front recalled a man matching his description. Said he'd seen him curled up in the back of a wrecked supply truck, using a rolled-up tarp as a blanket. He wore a faded Royal Air Force cap, odd for an army man, and clutched an empty flashlight like it still held light. He hadn't spoken much, just nodded when asked his name. But the accent, the coatless frame, the tired eyes, it had to be him. To many, Thomas Blake was just another face in the crowd of war. Quiet, forgettable, a ghost drifting through chaos. But to Sue Min, he had become something far more real. Proof that even in the harshest places, some people still chose kindness over comfort, selflessness over safety. And now she was willing to walk through that storm again to find him. She found him on a cold morning, just as the mist began to lift over the shattered hills. Thomas Blake stood alone beside a damaged field tent, his uniform worn thin, boots caked with mud, and his frame noticeably thinner than before. He looked like a man who had forgotten the weight of his own name, someone who had blended so completely into the background of war that even the sound of peace might feel foreign. When he saw her approaching, he froze. Sumin didn't smile. She didn't speak immediately. She simply stepped forward, pulled the familiar coat tighter around her shoulders, and looked him in the eyes. "You gave me something no officer ever has," she said gently. "Compassion." Thomas's expression flickered. He took a step back, uncertain. His voice, when it came, was low and tired. "A thank you card would have been enough," he muttered, as if trying to distance himself from the moment. But Sumin didn't let him retreat. She stepped closer, not with urgency, but with quiet resolve. "This isn't about gratitude," she replied. "This is a mission." Those words didn't land loudly, but they sank deep, and for a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Not surprise, not pride. Something older, something he hadn't felt in years. Dignity. Not the kind earned through medals or speeches, the kind that comes from being seen, from knowing your actions, even the smallest ones, mattered to someone. That despite everything he'd lost, there were still pieces of him that could be found, by others, and maybe, just maybe, by himself. In that stillness, surrounded by the echoes of war, Thomas Blake felt something shift inside. It wasn't redemption, but it was a beginning. Months had passed since that cold morning by the tents. The war had shifted, the front lines moved, but Thomas Blake remained much the same, quiet, steady, and always at the edges of things. Then came the letter, a formal summons to the headquarters of the Allied Medical Forces, now based in Tokyo. The envelope was clean, the ink too sharp, the kind of letter that made a man like Thomas uneasy. He arrived dressed plainly, his uniform patched and faded, his posture more cautious than proud. The building loomed, glass and stone, polished floors that echoed with the boots of men who looked younger, faster, newer. Thomas walked through the corridors with the kind of nervousness that only came from experience. Part of him expected bad news. Perhaps they were letting him go. He had heard the whispers. Too old, too tired, not fit for this new kind of war. But when the doors opened, Sumin Park was waiting. She didn't greet him with formality. She didn't salute. She simply handed him a file, slim but weighty. Inside it, a proposal, not a discharge, a job offer. They wanted him back, not as a soldier, not as a commander, but as something even more rare in wartime. A guide. The role was clear. Field advisor. To speak with young recruits, to teach them about empathy, resilience, and what it truly meant to carry responsibility when everything around you was falling apart. Thomas blinked. He didn't know what to say. Sumin looked him straight in the eye. Her voice was calm, but firm. "You gave away your only coat," she said. "To someone you didn't know, that's leadership." It wasn't about strategy. It wasn't about medals. It was about heart. And in that room, filled with maps and uniforms and war plans, Thomas Blake, once forgotten in the shadows of battle, was seen again. Not for what he could do with a rifle, but for what he had already done with a simple act of kindness. Sumin led him through the quiet streets just outside the city, where the noise of orders and marching boots gave way to the soft hum of daily life. They arrived at a modest but sturdy building, new, clean, and filled with the gentle buzz of voices and laughter. Above the door, a small wooden sign read, "Brothers of War Haven." Inside, it felt like another world. Children ran through open hallways, their feet echoing with life. Former soldiers, once hardened by war, sat calmly, some painting murals, others planting flowers in the garden. There was music playing somewhere, and the air smelled faintly of fresh bread and paint. Thomas stood still, quietly taking it all in. Then just past the entrance, he saw it, framed on the wall, in a place of honor. The drawing, his son's drawing. A little boy smiling beside a man in uniform, the words still there. "My father, my hero." He stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. The colors had faded slightly, but the heart of it remained. That simple picture, once folded in the pocket of an old coat, was now lighting the way for others. Sumin stood beside him, her voice soft. "This place exists because of you," she said. "You showed me that even the most broken heart can still bring hope to others." For years, Thomas had walked through war zones, feeling like a man left behind, useful only for what he could endure. But here, in this quiet refuge built from compassion, he saw something different. A legacy not made of medals or rank, but of moments, of choices, of kindness that rippled far beyond what he ever imagined. And for the first time in years, Thomas Blake wept, not from pain, not from grief, but because he had found something he thought he'd lost forever: his purpose. In the months that followed, Thomas Blake stepped into a new role, one that didn't require a weapon, a uniform in perfect condition, or a place in the chain of command. He became a mentor, not to one army, but to many. Soldiers came from all corners of the world: Peruvians, Filipinos, Nigerians, young men fighting on the same front under the United Nations banner, each carrying their own fears, burdens, and silent wounds. Most had never heard of Thomas Blake before, but once they met him, they didn't forget. He never lectured about tactics or battle formations. Instead, he spoke of something far harder to teach: emotional resilience, about surviving not just the war around you, but the war within. In quiet conversations under makeshift tents, beside flickering lanterns, or during long walks near the edge of the camps, Thomas shared truths carved from experience. Simple words, honest words, the kind that stay with you. You don't have to be strong all the time, he would say. You just have to keep going. Soon those phrases began to spread, repeated from soldier to soldier like quiet mantras. They appeared on scraps of paper, scribbled in notebooks, even carved into the wooden bunks of sleeping quarters. To many, Thomas became more than a mentor. He was a symbol of calm in the middle of chaos, a reminder that even the toughest battles could be survived with compassion and quiet strength. He was no longer the sergeant who built bridges across rivers. Now he was the man who rebuilt what war had broken inside others. And in doing so, he proved that even in the harshest chapters of history, one person's humanity could ripple across borders, across languages, and into the hearts of those who needed it most. In Tokyo, beneath soft lights and a sky brushed with the colors of evening, soldiers and veterans from around the world gathered for a special ceremony, the Day of Compassion in Combat. It wasn't about victories or medals. It was about something far more enduring, those quiet, often unseen moments of humanity that survived even in the darkest corners of war. The room was still when the final tribute was unveiled. On stage, resting behind glass, was a weathered military coat, faded, patched, and familiar. It was Thomas Blake's coat, the same one he had once placed on the shoulders of a stranger in the snow. Beneath it, a simple inscription: "One act of kindness can reignite a life." The crowd stood as Thomas was called to the stage. Older now, with silver streaking his hair and lines of time etched gently into his face, he stepped forward with quiet grace. He offered his thanks not with grand speeches, but with the humility of someone who had once believed they would be forgotten. Then he turned to Soo-min. His voice trembled, but not from fear. "You gave me back my name," he said softly, "my honor, and my son." From his coat pocket, he pulled a small, worn box. Inside was a ring, delicate, simple, beautiful. It had belonged to Emily, the woman he had once lost to the silence after war. For years, he had kept it tucked away, a memory too heavy to wear. But now, standing before the woman who had helped him find himself again, he opened the box and offered it, hands shaking, eyes full. There were no cheers, no music, just silence and the glisten of tears in countless eyes. Because in that moment, surrounded by those who understood the true cost of conflict, Thomas Blake reminded them all of something they had nearly forgotten, that even after everything, love could still begin again. Some stories are not written in the pages of history books or carved into monuments. They live quietly in the hearts of those who endured, who chose compassion over silence, and who found strength not in power, but in love. The wedding took place in the very heart of what they had helped build, a home for those who had lost everything. The walls were lined with photos of smiling soldiers, the room gently decorated with flags from many nations. Soo-min wore a simple white dress, radiant in her calm grace. Thomas stood beside her, his uniform carefully restored, the weight of memory balanced by the hope in his eyes. And at his side, the boy he thought he had lost forever, his son, stood proudly as his best man. At the entrance, hanging like a sacred memory, was the coat, faded, patched, but never forgotten. No longer just a piece of cloth, it had become a symbol of redemption, of quiet bravery, of the simple truth that even the smallest act of kindness can light the way through the darkest chapters. The photo of Thomas and Soo-min, side by side, arms linked in peace, traveled farther than they ever imagined, not because of fame or spectacle, but because it reminded people of what we too often forget, that within every soldier there is still a human being, and within every moment of pain there is still the possibility of healing. Their story is not one of war, but of what survives after it. Love, dignity, a second chance. Did you already know this story? What would you have done in his place? What other stories about soldiers and veterans should be told? If this story moved you, don't let it be forgotten. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this one. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and help keep their memory alive. See you in the next story.